What's up, y'all? This is the second lecture that I'm recording, and hopefully I'll be better than the first one. I'll try not to say so many times, because I found that that's what I do on each slide. So here we go. I'm going to give this another try. Oh gosh, I just did it. Anyways, we are covering the endocrine system. This is chapter 12, and I paired the endocrine system and the nervous system together for exam 4 because they do similar things. Now, I said this before talking about the nervous system, but reiterating that again with the endocrine system, because these systems, they both have the ultimate goal of homeostasis, which is essentially getting the body back into its happy place, which is happening all the time. And these systems use their medium to control the functions within the body, so the functions of all the cells. And like we learned in chapter 10, the nervous system uses electrical impulses as its medium to control cellular function. But the endocrine system has a different medium. And so the endocrine system uses hormones. And hormones are essentially chemicals that float around in the blood. And so this is what the endocrine system uses to control all the functions of all of our cells. Where do all of our hormones come from? That's the question. Well, we have these organs in our body called glands, and they're dispersed around our body, and they secrete these hormones into our bloodstream. Here are all the glands of the endocrine system. You can see them on the slide. Starting at the top, we have the pineal gland. It's located inside, kind of deep inside the brain. We also have the hypothalamus and the pituitary glands that are right next to each other, kind of right underneath the deep inside the brain. And then in the throat region, we have the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. And in the thoracic cavity, we have the thymus gland. And down, sitting right on top of both of our kidneys, we have our adrenal glands. And then also within the abdominal cavity, we have the pancreas, another gland that is functional in the endocrine system. And last, we have the ovaries and the testes, which are the reproductive glands of a male and a female. Now we're going to go into these glands in greater detail later on, and what their functions are and their related hormones. But let's talk about hormones by itself. Hormones are chemical influencers, and they influence almost every cell in your body. Just like neurotransmitters, there are specific receptors on specific cells to dictate what this hormone will actually do. Now, other cells can be exposed to particular hormones, but only the target cells of that specific hormone will have the appropriate receptors. So basically, they only match up with the cells that they can actually affect. Now, remember when we were learning the skin, there were the endocrine glands and the exocrine glands, right? Do you remember what the difference is between the endocrine and the exocrine glands? I'll let you think about that for a second. So here's the answer. Endocrine glands are ductless glands, and they secrete their hormones directly into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands have ducts, which means that they secrete their substance, and it's not always hormones, if at all, onto the surface of something else, such as our sudoriferous glands in our skin, the glands that secrete sweat. Again, the endocrine and the nervous systems complement one another to ensure that the body maintains homeostasis. They work in unison, performing these functions. Even though they have the same goal, they are different in many, many ways. So let's take a look at these differences on the slide here. Under the endocrine system, you'll see the endocrine system uses hormones, and it distributes these hormones via our bloodstream. And the endocrine system responds pretty slowly, but it also exerts a really long-lasting effect. So the endocrine system is said to adapt slowly to continual stimulation. It's our slow change. Then in the nervous system, you'll see the nervous system uses neurotransmitters along with electricity. And it secretes neurotransmitters into a synapse. And this allows for quick responses. The nervous system responds really quickly to stimuli. But its effect is pretty short-lived. It doesn't last for a really long time, unlike the endocrine system. So it's said to adapt quickly to continual stimulation, but it's a short-lived effect. Hormones come in two different types. They're either steroid or they're non-steroid. Steroid hormones are synthesized from cholesterol, which makes them lipid-based or fat-based. And non-steroid hormones are synthesized from amino acids, which makes them protein-based. The way these two types of hormones enter the cell also differs. Let's say a hormone is released into the bloodstream from a gland, and now it is on its way to its target cell somewhere in the body. Now, if this hormone is a steroid or a lipid-based hormone, it will pass easily through the cell's membrane, and then it will bind to a specific receptor that's in the nucleus. If the hormone is a non-steroid hormone or it's protein-based, these hormones actually do not pass easily through the cell membrane. They must bind to a receptor on the cell surface, remaining outside the cell, and this binding activates a second messenger system that is within the cell. Then, this second messenger system activates specific enzymes related to that second messenger system, which influence the cell's response to the hormone. So it's kind of a tertiary effect on how the cell responds to that protein-based non-steroid hormone. All right, quiz question. I'll give you a few seconds to see if you can answer this before I advance the slide. Which is a characteristic of endocrine glands? A, they employ neurotransmitters. B, ducts carry their secretions to the body surface. C, they exert a long-lasting effect. Or D, they respond quickly to stimuli. What do you think? All right, if you answered C, then you were correct. The nervous system is what uses neurotransmitters and responds quickly. The endocrine system uses hormones, but they do not secrete onto the body surface. So well done if you answered C. Now let's look at each of these glands that were mentioned on the earlier slide. And let's start with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland, along with the hypothalamus within the brain, influences more body processes than any other endocrine gland. It's quite impactful. The pituitary gland is located just underneath the hypothalamus, and it sits right inside the cella turcica of the sphenoid bone. Now I want you to think back to our bone chapter and remember what the sphenoid bone looked like. It was that butterfly-looking bone. There was one feature on the top of that bone. It kind of looked like a saddle, like a saddle to a horse. And that is the sella turcica, and that's where the pituitary gland sits. The pituitary gland is pea-shaped, and it has a stalk-like connection to the hypothalamus in the brain. And this is called the infundibulum, that little stalk-like connection. The pituitary gland is also divided into two parts. You have the anterior pituitary, which is more on the front of the body, or also known as the adenohypophysis. And then you also have the posterior pituitary, which is the part that's towards the back of the body. And the alternative name for the posterior pituitary is called the neurohypophysis. These two parts actually have different tissues within them, and they also secrete different hormones. The anterior pituitary, also known as the adenohypophysis, this part is the larger of the two parts of the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary consists of glandular tissue and is basically just told what to do by the hypothalamus. Cells that are within the hypothalamus release stimulating as well as inhibiting hormones into a system of blood vessels that's called the hypophyseal portal system. So this blood travels down that infundibulum and straight to the anterior pituitary, where whatever that hormone was tells target cells within the anterior pituitary to release more or release less of its hormone. So again, the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary what to do. It can say stimulating messages or it can say inhibiting messages. And then there's another hormone inside the anterior pituitary that either gets released more or gets released less depending on that message from the hypothalamus. This is a three-step process of hormone release. 1, the hypothalamus releases a hormone that either stimulates or inhibits a number 2 hormone inside the anterior pituitary. Then the anterior pituitary, if told to release more hormone, will release a third hormone, which is will release its hormone that is directed to another gland in the body. Then that gland will secrete the third hormone as a result of this stimulation from the pituitary. So here's an example. If you look at bullet point number 2, thyrotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyrotropin, or thyroid stimulating hormone. In turn, this thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete its hormone, whatever it has. So this is a list of the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus. We will look at the ones released from the anterior pituitary next. But I want you to remember that the hypothalamus releases the first hormone, and it can be inhibitory or stimulating. The anterior pituitary releases its second hormone that is either told to release more or less from the hypothalamus. Then that hormone travels to a target gland out in the body that releases the third hormone that eventually makes it to the target organ. Now let's look at the anterior pituitary and how it responds to the hypothalamus. Here are the hormones that are released from the anterior pituitary. So think about this. This is the second step in this control from starting with the hypothalamus. So the anterior pituitary, if told by the hypothalamus, say it releases thyroid stimulating hormone. This hormone, TSH, stimulates the thyroid gland, step 3, to secrete thyroid hormone. Let's say the anterior pituitary released prolactin. Now, prolactin stimulates milk production in the mammary glands of females. In males, it may make the testes more sensitive to luteinizing hormone. Or let's say the anterior pituitary released adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, this hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete corticosteroids, and that's going to be the target organ after that. Now, let's say the anterior pituitary releases follicle-stimulating hormone. So this hormone stimulates the production of eggs in the ovaries of female and sperms in the testes of the males. Next, we've got luteinizing hormones. The anterior pituitary, let's say it releases luteinizing hormone. So what's next is it will stimulate ovulation and estrogen and progesterone synthesis in females, and it also stimulates the secretion of testosterone by the testes in males. Or anterior pituitary can release growth hormone. Now, growth hormone acts on the entire body to promote protein synthesis, lipid and carbohydrate metabolism, as well as bone and skeletal muscle growth. Again, I want you to think about this as this 3-step process. Memorizing all of these hormones is not necessary, but I would like you to kind of be familiar with them. And I mainly want you to memorize the process. It goes hypothalamus to anterior pituitary to a target gland in the body to a target organ. The posterior pituitary is a bit different. It's made up of neural tissue or nervous tissue instead of glandular tissue, which means that it's full of nerve fibers that originate actually in the hypothalamus. So instead of synthesizing hormones from the hypothalamus's control, the posterior pituitary basically just stores 2 hormones in it until a later time when they're needed. Those 2 hormones that are stored are called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, as well as oxytocin. So if you can remember, oxytocin is what stimulates uterine contractions during childbirth. We talked about this in the example of positive feedback. Antidiuretic hormone causes the kidneys to reduce urine volume, so it makes you pee less, in order to prevent dehydration. So this one is also commonly called vasopressin. So essentially, these 2 hormones just sit there in the posterior pituitary until the hypothalamus stimulates it to release them. And the hypothalamus stimulates it via nervous tissue rather than hormones through that portal system. Two things control the release of pituitary hormones. One is the brain, of course, and 2 is negative feedback from that target organ. The brain monitors the condition of the body throughout all of its other channels, and it triggers hormone release when it's needed. But if you guys remember negative feedback, or if you remember how it works, basically when a stimulus is received by an effector, that effector's action then causes the stimulus to stop. So here's an example. Cold, the stimulus, it causes the hypothalamus to release thyrotropin-releasing hormone. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyroid-stimulating hormone. Now, thyroid-stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. Now, these thyroid hormones will stimulate your muscles actually to upregulate their metabolism, and this is what increases warmth. Now, warmth, then that message gets sent back, and it will actually inhibit the release of thyroid stimulating hormone by the pituitary in that negative feedback loop. So because of these controls, the secretion of pituitary hormones occurs in phases or in pulses. It's actually not constantly releasing. It's kind of just on and off. So I'd like to just quickly review the differences between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So I recommend writing down what I'm saying here. So the anterior pituitary, first, it's controlled by hormones from the hypothalamus. Second, it synthesizes many other hormones depending on the direction from that hypothalamus. Third, it's actually involved in a 3-step process of influence on a target organ. Fourth, it consists of glandular tissue and blood vessels. Now the posterior pituitary, let's talk about its characteristics. First, it's controlled by the hypothalamus through nerves. Second, it stores only 2 hormones, ADH and oxytocin. Third, it influences target organs directly. It does not involve that 3-step process. And fourth, it consists of nervous tissue, not glandular tissue. All right, quiz question. A key difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary is that the posterior pituitary does what? A, consists of glandular tissue. B, secretes hormones under the direction of the hypothalamus. C, receives hormones from the hypothalamus via the hypophyseal portal system. Or D, stores hormones released from the hypothalamus. All right, if you picked D, then you were correct. Basically, all the other statements are characteristics of the anterior pituitary only. Moving on to our next gland, we have the pineal gland. The pineal gland is tucked up in the center of the brain and is this gland produces a hormone called melatonin. Probably have heard of that before. So melatonin is a hormone that rises at night when sunlight is absent, when it's dark, and then it falls during the day when we have sun exposure. Now, high melatonin levels trigger sleepiness, making it a key factor in the sleep-wake cycle. And low melatonin is related to being awake and alert. Researchers also speculate that the pineal gland may also regulate the onset of puberty, as this onset of puberty also has a circadian rhythm. So I want you to associate the pineal gland with your circadian rhythm. It secretes the hormone melatonin, which is involved in your sleeping and waking cycle. Next, we have the thymus gland. The thymus gland lies in the mediastinum, that cavity between your 2 lungs, and it's just beneath the sternum. And it's quite large in children and then shrinks to mostly fat and fibrous tissue by the time you are old. The hormones secreted by the thymus gland are thymosin and thymopoietin. These both have a role in the development of your immune system. hence why it's quite large in children and then gets smaller as you get old. Because it secretes hormones, the thymus is a member of the endocrine system, but because of the actions of those hormones that they are to develop the immune system, the thymus is also a member of the immune system. Next, we have the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is the largest endocrine gland and consists of two large lobes connected by a narrow band of tissue in the middle called the isthmus. It's located in your neck and it wraps around the anterior as well as the lateral portions of your trachea. Looking deeper into the thyroid gland, the tissue is made of tiny sacs, and these tiny sacs are called thyroid follicles. Each follicle is filled with thyroid colloid in the middle, and then around each of these follicles, or these sacs, is a lining of cells that secrete two main hormones. The two main hormones that are secreted by these cells are triiodothyronine, or T3, and thyroxine, or T4. The thyroid gland can also store hormones for later use, similar to the posterior pituitary. Other cells are located between the thyroid follicles, and these cells are called parafollicular cells. These cells secrete an additional hormone called calcitonin. Calcitonin responds to increasing blood calcium levels. So calcitonin basically triggers the deposition of calcium into your bone and thus promotes bone formation. So essentially, if blood calcium levels increase, then calcitonin gets released to take that calcium out of your blood and put it into your bones. Overall, the purpose of the thyroid is to increase metabolic rate as well as promote growth in bone, nerves, skin, hair, nails, and teeth. So it's quite an important gland and has some important hormones. On the back of your thyroid gland, the posterior surface, you have four little glands called parathyroid glands. And these secrete the aptly named hormone parathyroid hormone, or PTH. So this hormone maintains normal blood levels of calcium. Levels of calcium affect nerve and muscle function, blood clotting, cell membrane permeability, as well as the function of certain enzymes. So maintaining adequate levels of calcium is extremely important. So where do you think the calcium comes from when the parathyroid releases parathyroid hormone? So PTH inhibits new bone formation and stimulates the breakdown of old bone. And this causes calcium to move out of the bone and back into the blood. Parathyroid hormone also encourages the kidneys to reabsorb calcium instead of excreting it in your urine. And also, parathyroid hormone prompts the kidneys to activate vitamin D, which is important for intestinal absorption of calcium from your food, which is then transported into the blood. So essentially, parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone, and they pull calcium from your bones. They pull it from your kidneys, and they also pull it from your intestines to then increase the blood levels of your calcium. So basically, the thyroid and the parathyroid work together to keep blood calcium levels at a homeostatic level. So let's read this schematic here, starting with the left, to talk about the calcium homeostasis. So first, let's say that your blood calcium levels are high. There's calcium in excess. This stimulates the thyroid gland to release calcitonin from those parafollicular cells. Calcitonin then moves all of that calcium from the blood and deposits it into the bone, which then eventually makes the blood calcium levels decrease back to a normal level or homeostasis. Now let's start from the right side of the slide. Let's say that you have low calcium in your blood or a blood calcium deficiency. This causes parathyroid gland to release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone acts on multiple places, so it acts on the bones, it acts on your kidneys, and it also acts on your intestines to then pull calcium either from your food, from your urine, or from the bone deposition, and then move it into the bloodstream. And this allows the calcium levels in your blood to increase, again bringing it back to normal calcium levels or homeostasis. Calcitonin, which is secreted by the thyroid, has an antagonistic effect on parathyroid hormone. And so the interaction of these two hormones helps your body achieve calcium homeostasis, which is incredibly important for normal functions of things like your muscles, your heart, blood clotting, as well as other really pertinent functions. Quiz question. Which endocrine gland has a role in the immune system? Your thymus, your thyroid, your pineal, or your pituitary gland? If you guessed thymus, then you are correct. Good job. Next, we have our adrenal glands. You have two adrenal glands, and they sit atop each of your two kidneys. And within each adrenal gland, you have two distinct parts. You have an inner portion, and you have an outer portion. The inner portion, also known as the adrenal medulla, consists of neurons that function as part of our sympathetic nervous system. If you remember, the sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight, the excited arousal part of your nervous system. The outer portion, also known as the adrenal cortex, is actually glandular tissue, and it secretes steroid hormones, also called corticosteroids. So in the medulla, you have special cells called chromaffin cells. These chromaffin cells secrete catecholamines, and the catecholamines are epinephrine and norepinephrine. You might recognize these two words from our discussion with the sympathetic nervous system. Now, I said before, epinephrine and norepinephrine can be considered neurotransmitters if they're released from a neuron, but if they're released from a gland, they're called catecholamines and referred to as hormones. So catecholamines prepare our body for physical activity. So this is what helps with our arousal and fight or flight system. So it increases our heart rate, it increases blood pressure, it stimulates circulation to the muscles, and it also dilates the bronchioles of your lungs. So catecholamines, like I said, are part of this fight or flight response. And it also boosts glucose levels in our blood. So catecholamines cause a couple of processes to take glycogen, our stored form of carbohydrate, and turn it into glucose so that it ends up in the bloodstream to then fuel, say, our muscles if we've got to run away from a monster. So these processes of breaking down glycogen into glucose, there's a couple of ways to do this. Or actually, for glycogen, it's called glycogenolysis. So basically, glycogen that's stored in your muscles or stored in your liver gets turned into glucose through this process called glycogenolysis, and this process is stimulated by these catecholamines. Also, another way of getting glucose in the blood is a process called gluconeogenesis. So gluconeogenesis is producing glucose out of other things such as amino acids. So in your liver, you've got amino acids stored there, and they can turn into glucose through this process of gluconeogenesis, and that process is stimulated by these catecholamines from our adrenal glands. So all of that's happening from the medulla, the inner portion of the adrenal glands. Now in the adrenal cortex, you'll see in the blow-up picture on this slide, it actually has 3 layers to it. And these layers are what are responsible for secreting steroid hormones, also known as corticosteroids. So if you look at this slide, the outermost layer is called the zona glomerulosa. And this layer secretes mineralocorticoids. Then the next layer down, the zona fasciculata, secretes glucocorticoids. And then the innermost layer there of the cortex is called the zona reticularis. And this layer secretes sex steroids. Here are those 3 classifications of hormones we just talked about that were secreted from the adrenal cortex. So let's start with the mineralocorticoids. An example is aldosterone. Aldosterone acts on your kidneys to promote sodium retention and potassium excretion. So basically, if we're not peeing out the sodium, we're keeping it in the bloodstream, water is going to follow that sodium, and that causes water retention and an increase in blood volume. Second, glucocorticoids. An example is cortisol. So cortisol is released in response to bodily stress. So it's really helpful in repairing damaged tissues, say from a big workout. But if released over a long period of time, it actually has a negative effect on the immune system. So athletes that are typically overtrained will have high cortisol levels. These levels were not able to recover, and this will affect the immune system in a negative way. And the sex steroids. So the sex steroids include small amounts of testosterone as well as small amounts of estrogen. So these stimulate the development of pubic and axillary hair as well as sustain sex drive in both males and females. Your pancreas are actually an organ that contains both endocrine and exocrine tissue. The pancreas are nestled right in the nook of your duodenum, which is the first section of your small intestines, and this allows it to directly aid in your digestion. The exocrine cells, called Acini cells, secrete digestive enzymes into ducts that drain directly into the small intestines. It also has clusters of endocrine cells called the islets of Langerhans, and they secrete hormones into the bloodstream to control your blood glucose levels. These clusters, or these islets, they contain 3 types of cells. You've got alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells. The alpha cells secrete the hormone glucagon, basically when your blood glucose levels are really low. So this might happen during overnight, a fasted period, or between meals. And glucagon will stimulate the liver to convert glycogen into glucose, as well as convert lactate and amino acids into glucose. This production of new glucose from these other things are called gluconeogenesis, if you remember from the other slide. The resulting glucose is then released into the bloodstream, and this causes blood glucose levels to then increase, going back to normal. The beta cells secrete the hormone insulin. You might be familiar with this hormone. After eating, the levels of glucose in your blood are quite high. And so insulin will then stimulate cells to absorb all of this glucose, causing it to go back down in your blood. So insulin brings blood glucose down, glucagon brings blood glucose back up. Then the delta cells, they secrete somatostatin. So this hormone is essentially an inhibitor of the glucagon and the insulin, as well as growth hormone that is secreted by those other endocrine cells in your pancreas. So this one just basically regulates the alpha and the beta cells. So these hormones, glucagon and insulin, from your alpha and beta cells in your pancreas are quite busy fellas. So here's a picture of how they work in regulating your blood glucose. Let's walk through these steps together. So after eating, blood glucose levels are high, and glucose flows from the digestive tract into that bloodstream, causing them to be high. Then, this high glucose levels stimulate the beta cells of the pancreas to release insulin. Insulin then triggers two reactions. It stimulates the cells to take up more glucose. It also causes the liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. And the combined result is that glucose levels then return back to normal in your blood. Now, when blood glucose levels drop or get low, such as like after skipping a meal overnight when you're really hungry, the alpha cells in the pancreas will release glucagon into the blood. Now, glucagon stimulates the liver to break down the stored glycogen and turn it into glucose, which then releases it into the bloodstream. And this causes blood glucose levels to then come back up to normal levels. So let's talk about what happens in diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is basically an autoimmune disorder where the body destroys its own beta cells. So this causes this person to not be able to release any insulin, and therefore they end up having to take injections of insulin to manage the glucose rise in their blood. Now, type 2 diabetes, this develops after a lifestyle of typically physical inactivity and overeating. And so essentially what this does is this constant high glucose in the blood causes the pancreas to overwork, producing tons and tons of insulin. Now, this bombardment of insulin to the receptors on the cells, it damages the receptors over time. And then these cells become resistant to the insulin. They basically get worn out. And so this is what is called insulin resistance. Your pancreas are producing it, but the cells don't respond to it by taking in glucose. They're tired. And eventually, over time, the pancreatic beta cells wear out even producing the insulin, and then therefore this person of type 2 diabetes could end up being insulin dependent and having to take injections. Let's take a deeper look into the effects of insulin and glucagon. So I want you to find insulin on the slide here. And insulin stimulates essentially cell utilization or cell storage of that glucose. So I want you to think of insulin as the storage or utilization hormone. And then glucagon, I want you to think of it as the mobilizing hormone. And glucose is what is being moved around. So again, taking a look at insulin on this slide here, you'll see that plasma glucose, it affects it in three ways. Primarily, insulin will cause this glucose to then go into the liver, and that glucose gets stored away as glycogen. Or it can take this plasma glucose and it can store it away as glycogen in the muscles. So this is primarily where it's going to take this extra glucose in the blood and put it away. However, the areas in the muscle and the liver are limited in size, and so they can only store so much glycogen. So if the glycogen stores are full, then insulin will take whatever excess glucose there is. It takes a fatty acid and binds it to the glucose, making a triglyceride, which then gets stored away in your adipose or fat tissue. So this is where people will say carbohydrates make you fat, only if your glycogen stores are full and you don't have any need for the glucose in your body. Now, glucagon, if you take a look at the bottom there, remember glucagon is the mobilizing hormone. So this will take glucose out of those storage areas and put it back, glycogen out of the storage areas, turn it into glucose, and then put that glucose into the blood. So first of all, glucagon is going to act on your liver first. So it's going to take the glycogen and turn it into glucose. It's also going to take amino acids or the glycerol that's stored in the liver and turn it into glucose in that process of gluconeogenesis. And then it will take that glucose and put it into the blood. Now, only if those stores are completely used will it then start acting on the adipose tissue. And so it will actually act on these triglycerides that are stored in the adipose tissue. It separates the fatty acids from the glycerol in that molecule and then releases that into the bloodstream as plasma-free fatty acids and glucose. So again, this latter way that glucagon works on the adipose tissue is incredibly slow and requires a whole nother process called beta oxidation to mobilize those triglycerides. So it's not something that happens very often. It's really only happening in, say, starvation situations. All right, so the last organs in the endocrine system that we're going to talk about are the gonads. So these are the sex organs in males, called the testes, and the sex organs in females, called the ovaries. So the primary hormone produced by the testes is testosterone, and the primary hormone produced by the ovaries is estrogen. So these sex hormones stimulate the production of eggs in females and the production of sperm in males. Estrogen also helps promote the development of female characteristics as well as the development of the reproductive system. So in females, after ovulation, another hormone is secreted called progesterone. Progesterone, in combination with estrogen, helps maintain the uterine lining during pregnancy. So if a female is not pregnant, during and after ovulation in the menstrual cycle, these hormones will actually be quite high. At the onset of menses, which is when she gets her period, these hormones drop down to basal levels. In males, testosterone triggers the development of male sexual characteristics. It stimulates the acquisition of muscle mass, as well as sustains sperm production. If you remember back from chapter 9, the muscles, you'll remember our 3 energy systems, and you'll also remember the muscle fiber types that we have. So these 2 sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, have a massive impact on which substrate is used in priority in those energy systems, as well as the proportion of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So this is where you get a lot of the gender differences or sex differences in energy utilization as well as exercise performance. Okay, quiz question. So the chief role of insulin is to what? Stimulate cells to take up glucose, stimulate the liver to break down stored glycogen, stimulate the pancreas to release glucagon, or trigger the conversion of fatty acids and amino acids into glucose. What's your guess? If you picked A, then you were correct. Insulin is responsible for stimulating our cells to take up our glucose. All right, so that concludes this lecture on the endocrine system, or chapter 12. Again, please email me or message me on Blackboard, wherever, if you have any questions about any of this material. Okay, until next time, talk to you soon.